A train crosses open ocean on a bridge built more than a century ago. Below it, the sea once swept an entire passenger train from the line. Somewhere else, a train climbs a mountain by going backward, then forward, then backward again, because there was no other way to get it up the slope. Somewhere else, a bridge only meters high still carries commuters over a jungle valley on steel poured during a colonial occupation that ended generations ago. Somewhere else, a railway was built by prisoners of war and forced laborers who died faster than the track could be laid. And somewhere else, right now, once a year, people climb onto the roofs of moving trains. Not because they want to, but because there is no room left inside. Some of these railways still carry trains today. Others have been rebuilt, reopened, or replaced. But in every case, the risk that created them never fully disappeared. So the question is not why these railways were built. The question is why the risk is still considered worth it, when almost every part of these lines argues that it shouldn't be. These 7 railways were never built because they were safe. They were built because something else mattered more. Trade across open water, gold buried in frozen mountains, victory in a war measured in dead laborers, faith that pulls millions toward a single riverbank in Bangladesh, no matter how full the trains already are. The engineers who built these lines did not remove the danger. They calculated how much of it people were willing to accept, and then built exactly up to that line, and sometimes past it. 7 railways, 7 different reasons the risk was judged worth taking. We start on the coast of southern India, where a British-built bridge tried to hold back the sea. And for most of a century, it did. Chapter 1. Pamban Bridge, the sea bridge that outlived the storm. 2 kilometers of steel laid directly over the sea. No breakwater, no shelter, just open water on both sides, and a narrow line of track running straight through the middle of it. This is the Pamban Bridge, connecting the island town of Rameshwaram to mainland India across the Palk Strait in the state of Tamil Nadu. It opened in February 1914. It was India's first sea bridge, and for decades, its only one. At its center sat something almost unthinkable for the era, a manually operated lift span, engineered so the middle section could be raised on command, letting ships pass beneath the railway before lowering back into place in time for the next train. No motors, no automation, just a small crew of workers cranking open a bridge over open ocean, day after day for the better part of a century. Most people assume a structure like this couldn't survive a real storm. In 1964, it was tested directly. A cyclone tore through the region, one of the most violent storms to strike the Tamil Nadu coast in living memory. It leveled the nearby town of Dhanushkodi almost completely. A passenger train caught on the tracks that night was swept from the rails, and accounts from the period described roughly 200 lives lost in the disaster. The bridge itself stayed standing. That distinction became the story people told about it. Officially, Pamban Bridge turned into a symbol of engineering that could take a direct hit from the ocean and hold its line, while the town beside it did not. But holding a storm is not the same as holding time. For the next half-century, the bridge kept running, repaired after the cyclone, converted from meter gauge to broad gauge in the 2000s, reinforced again to carry heavier freight trains than it was ever originally designed for. Each upgrade asked more of the same aging steel. By the early 2020s, the saltwater finally caught up with it. Inspection reports described serious structural weakening in the bridge's lifting section, corrosion severe enough that in December 2022, Indian Railways made a decision it had avoided for over 100 years. It stopped all rail traffic across the old bridge, permanently. For more than 2 years, Rameshwaram sat without a direct rail link to the mainland, waiting on a replacement that was still under construction. That replacement finally opened in April 2025, a new vertical lift sea bridge built parallel to the original, engineered for double the traffic, and a lifespan measured in centuries rather than decades. The old bridge did not disappear quietly. In early 2026, it was raised one final time for passing ships, before demolition crews moved in. Reports describe the dismantling itself as difficult. Heavy equipment brought in to take apart a structure that had spent over 100 years standing directly in the path of the open sea, with at least one crane involved in the removal work, toppling before the job could continue. But the corrosion was never really the hardest problem here. Steel fails eventually, no matter how well it's built. The harder question was whether a rail crossing over open sea at this exact point, expensive to build, expensive to maintain, constantly fighting saltwater, was still worth rebuilding at all, instead of leaving the island to boats and road traffic alone. India rebuilt it anyway. For a century, the old bridge carried pilgrims, monsoons, wars, and salt corrosion, and mostly won. Its replacement now carries that same weight on newer steel, because the answer to that harder question was yes. But if a colonial-era bridge over open ocean could survive a cyclone and still eventually lose to something as slow as rust, what happens when a railway is built somewhere the ground isn't the danger at all, where the real problem is what's waiting 80 meters straight down? Chapter 2. Cikubang Bridge, the colonial steel bridge still carrying trains. 80 meters above a river valley in West Java, a steel bridge built before the First World War still carries passenger trains across the gap every single day. The Cikubang Bridge stretches roughly 300 meters across the Cikubang River Gorge on the railway line connecting Jakarta and Bandung. It opened in 1906, engineered by Dutch colonial railway builders to move plantation exports, tea, coffee, quinine, down from the highlands to the coast for shipment. It is commonly described today as the longest active railway bridge in Indonesia. From the highway that runs alongside it, the bridge looks almost too delicate for its job. Thin steel lattice, tall support piers, a single track running across the top with nothing underneath but air and a long drop into the valley floor. Most travelers assume a structure this old, still carrying modern trains, must be operating on borrowed time. The engineering tells a more deliberate story. In 1953, as steam locomotives gave way to diesel, the bridge was reinforced. Semicircular metal arches were added beneath the rail bed, specifically to absorb the heavier load of the new engines. That retrofit is a large part of why the original 19th century steel is still doing its job more than 100 years after it was first assembled. But age is not the only tension built into this crossing. Trains slow down noticeably as they approach it. Drivers reduce speed before committing a fully loaded train to 80 meters of open air on a structure originally built for a colonial rail network that never anticipated the volume of traffic now moving through it. Because this bridge was not designed for today's Jakarta-Bandung corridor, one of the busiest passenger lines in the country, carrying long-distance and commuter trains back-to-back through the same narrow crossing all day, every day. It was designed to move colonial cargo at colonial speeds for a fraction of the traffic it now absorbs. There is also no easy way around it. The valley is exactly why the bridge was built here in the first place. Steep slopes on both sides, with no practical route for track except straight across the gap. If Cikubang ever needed major repairs that shut it down, there is no quick detour. Trains between two of Indonesia's largest cities would lose their most direct link, forced onto far longer routes or suspended until the bridge reopened. So the bridge cannot be allowed to fail. Every inspection, every reinforcement, every reduced speed crossing exists to keep this single span from becoming the point where the entire corridor stops. That is the quiet contradiction tourists rarely notice as they photograph the bridge from the valley road below. A modern passenger train, moving at speed, riding on a lattice of colonial-era ironwork suspended 80 meters above the valley floor. Two different centuries of engineering stacked directly on top of each other, holding up a corridor that cannot afford for either one to fail. It still works. It has always still worked. But somewhere else, in a different mountain range on the other side of the planet, engineers of that same era did not have the option of laying a bridge across a valley and calling it solved. They had to go straight through the mountain instead, or over it, one impossible zigzag at a time, blasting the track into the rock as they went. Chapter 3: White Pass and Yukon Route, the railway carved into the Gold Rush Mountain Railway. Before this railway existed, reaching the Klondike goldfields meant crossing a mountain pass on foot, carrying roughly a year's worth of supplies on your back, because Canadian authorities required it to keep the flood of prospectors from starving once they crossed the border into Yukon territory. Thousands of pack horses died on the trail leading up to the pass. Accounts from the period describe the route as littered with animal carcasses by the peak of the rush, worked to death by inexperienced stampeders who had no idea what they were walking into. In 1898, a company decided there was a faster way through: blast a railway straight into the coastal mountains between the port town of Skagway, Alaska, and the Yukon interior. Construction began that May. In just 20 miles, the line climbs from sea level to nearly 3,000 feet on grades steep enough that engineers had to design turns tighter than almost anything attempted in North American railway construction up to that point. Roughly 35,000 people are cited as having worked on the railway during construction, some for a single day before quitting, others for the full 2 years it took to complete. The railway's own historical records cite 35 confirmed deaths during that period, on a project that used hundreds of tons of explosives to blast ledges for the track directly into vertical rock faces. Workers were lowered by rope to drill and plant charges on cliff walls, with nothing beneath them but open air and a drop to the canyon floor. The common assumption is that a railway built this fast, through terrain this hostile, must have been reckless by any modern engineering standard. But speed was the entire point of the project. Gold does not wait for careful planning. By the time the final spike was driven in the summer of 1900, the frenzy that had justified the railway in the first place was already fading. The richest claims had been staked years earlier, and the rush that built this line was becoming history, even as the line itself was finally completed. The railway kept running anyway, first hauling ore and freight through the mountains it had been blasted into, later shifting into something else entirely. Today, White Pass and Yukon Route operates primarily as a scenic excursion railway, carrying cruise ship passengers up the same grades, past the same cliffs, along a route that engineers once considered too dangerous and too expensive to ever finish. The danger that built it never fully left the mountain. It simply stopped being the reason people ride it. What replaced it was the view. Thousands of tourists now travel every summer through a landscape that once required lowering men on ropes just to prepare the ground for a single length of track. But not every mountain railway on this list made that transition so cleanly, or left the danger safely in the past. Because the next line was built beside something that never stopped being dangerous. A volcano that is still, to this day, active. Chapter 4: Minami Aso Railway, the line built beside a living volcano. In April 2016, a series of earthquakes tore through Kumamoto Prefecture in Japan, powerful enough to collapse bridges, cave-in tunnels, and wash entire sections of railway track off the hillside they were built on. The Minami Aso Railway, A small local line running through the floor of Mount Aso's caldera was one of the hardest hit pieces of infrastructure in the region. Most of the line stopped running that year. Some sections stayed closed for 7 years. Mount Aso is not a dormant backdrop for the railway. It sits at the center of one of the largest volcanic calderas on Earth, roughly 18 kilometers across, and it remains one of Japan's most closely monitored active volcanic systems, a mountain where access to the crater itself is opened and closed depending on current gas readings and seismic activity. The railway does not run across an erupting volcano. It runs across the floor of the caldera that volcano created over hundreds of thousands of years, a landscape defined by fault lines, unstable slopes, and a documented history of sudden geological failure that had already destroyed this exact railway once in 2016. That distinction matters because the easy assumption is that rebuilding a train line inside an active volcanic caldera after an earthquake already tore it apart is simply inviting the same disaster twice. Railway engineers took the opposite approach. Reconstruction meant rebuilding collapsed bridges and tunnels to updated seismic standards, reassessing unstable slopes section by section, and in several places, redesigning structures rather than simply repairing what had failed. Some of the rebuilt spans now stand on entirely new foundations beside the stumps of the originals, a visible reminder for anyone riding past of exactly how much of this line had to be rebuilt rather than simply patched. Full service resumed in July 2023. 7 years after the earthquake, the entire Takamori line reopened for the first time since the disaster, running trains once again from Tateno to Takamori through the heart of the caldera. For 7 years, students who once rode the line to school made the trip by bus instead, on roads that took longer. Local businesses that depended on the line's seasonal sightseeing traffic lost income they had counted on for decades. When the last section finally reopened, it was treated less like a scheduling update than a milestone, proof that the region itself had come back from the earthquake, not just the tracks. Today, the line runs a seasonal open-window sightseeing train through the caldera, the same fault-scarred hillsides that took the railway apart less than a decade ago. The mountain has not become any safer. The trains simply learned to run on a shorter leash, rebuilt to standards that assume the ground beneath them could move again, because it already has, and almost certainly will. That is one version of railway danger, a landscape that fails suddenly, without warning, and takes the tracks with it. The next railway on this list faced the opposite problem entirely. Danger that was visible from the very first survey, built into the shape of the mountain before a single section of track was ever laid. Chapter 5: Devil's Nose, the train that climbed a wall of rock. In the early 1900s, engineers building a railway between Ecuador's coast and its capital ran straight into a wall. Not a metaphorical one, an actual vertical rock face in the Andes, a formation so steep that surveyors of the time considered it nearly impossible to route a railway through at all. Locals called it Nariz del Diablo, the Devil's Nose. The solution was a series of tight switchbacks cut directly into the cliff face. The train climbs a short stretch, stops, reverses onto a second track angled back in the opposite direction, climbs again, and repeats the pattern until it has descended more than 500 meters of elevation in just 12.5 kilometers. At points along the route, the locomotive pushes the train from behind instead of pulling it. Crew members still climb out to manually switch the tracks at marked points along the slope, signs warning of the change ahead. At the time, it became known as one of the most difficult railways ever built. Historical accounts of the construction describe extraordinarily harsh working conditions and heavy loss of life among the laborers who cut the line into the rock by hand. though exact figures from that era are difficult to verify with certainty, and estimates across different sources vary considerably. What is not in dispute is what happened after that grueling construction period ended. The railway kept running for most of a century, carrying freight and passengers through a stretch of track that other engineers of the era had refused to even attempt. Then, gradually, it stopped. Ecuador's national rail network fell into steady decline through the 2010s, and in 2020, economic pressure combined with the pandemic forced most passenger service across the country's railways to shut down entirely, including, for years, the Devil's Nose. For a long stretch, the most famous railway descent in South America simply sat unused, its switchbacks empty. It reopened in August 2025, following a restoration effort, once again carrying passengers down the same zigzag descent that a century earlier required workers to be talked down a cliff face by hand, one rope length at a time. The line's history is one of repeated stops and restarts, closed, reopened, closed again, often depending as much on funding and political will as on the condition of the tracks themselves. As of the most recent reporting, the Devil's Nose is running as a heritage tourist railway, with a limited number of departures each week from the mountain town of Alosi, not a restored national rail service. The cliff that made this railway famous never changed. What kept changing was whether anyone still believed the ride down it was worth keeping open. But not every railway on this list survived, or nearly disappeared, because of tourism revenue or engineering pride. The next one was built because of a war, and the price paid for it was measured in human lives, not construction budgets or ticket sales. Chapter 6: The Death Railway, the line built on forced labor. This railway earned its name during construction, not afterward as a dramatic label added by tourism boards decades later, but at the time, from the people who were forced to build it. In 1942, the Japanese military began construction of a rail line connecting Thailand to Burma, intended to supply occupying troops without relying on sea routes that had become vulnerable to Allied attack. The line stretched roughly 415 kilometers, cut through dense jungle, across wide rivers, and directly through solid rock, carved largely by hand, on a construction schedule that gave engineers barely more than a year to finish what should reasonably have taken several. The workforce was made up of Allied prisoners of war and Asian civilian laborers, conscripted and transported under conditions that left almost no margin for survival. Minimal food, tropical disease with no real medical care, forced overwork in extreme heat, and violence used routinely to enforce the pace of construction. According to many historical accounts, more than 90,000 Asian civilian laborers and roughly 16,000 Allied prisoners of war died during the railway's construction, from starvation, disease, exhaustion, and direct brutality. One of the deadliest sections was a stretch of solid rock later named Hellfire Pass, cut through the mountain using little more than hand tools and explosives, workers laboring around the clock under torchlight to meet an impossible deadline. The line was finished in 1943. It had been built at a human cost that historians have spent decades since trying to fully document and understand. A cost measured not in construction budgets, but in the deaths of people who never had any real choice about being there in the first place. After the war, much of the original railway fell into disuse, damaged and left unmaintained across most of its length. But a section of the route, running roughly 130 kilometers between Nong Pla Duk and Nam Tak in Thailand, was rebuilt and reopened to rail traffic. That section is still running today, carrying both local commuters and visitors. Trains cross a rebuilt bridge over the River Kwai, pass along the same river valley the original laborers cut through by hand, and terminate near Hellfire Pass, a site now preserved as a memorial and interpretive center, honoring the people who died building the ground the tracks now rest on. This is not a railway that survived because someone found a clever new use for the route. It survived because enough people chose to remember what it cost and made sure that history stayed attached to the rails instead of being quietly paved over and forgotten. Every other railway on this list was built to move something forward. Gold, trade, faith, tourism revenue. This one was built to move an army at a price the people forced to build it never agreed to pay and never had the power to refuse. The final railway on this list is different again. It was not built through danger. It became dangerous through the sheer number of people who now depend on it all at once for 3 days every single year. Chapter 7. Bangladesh, Tongi, the trains that carry more people than they were ever meant to hold. Every January, millions of people converge on a stretch of religious gatherings on the planet. It's called the Bishwa Ijtema, widely described as the second largest Muslim gathering in the world after the Hajj. Because of its sheer scale, the event has been split into multiple sessions since the early 2010s, simply to manage the volume of people arriving in Tongi from across the country and abroad. When the final prayer ends, everyone tries to leave at once. Railway authorities schedule special trains to help move the crowd. Extra services, added capacity, adjusted timetables, the kind of planning that works, on paper, for a large but predictable surge in passenger demand. This surge is never predictable. It is simply enormous. Images from the event, year after year, show trains so full that people ride on the roofs, cling to the sides, and pack themselves onto the couplings between carriages. Because the platforms are full, the carriages are full, and the alternative is hours on gridlocked roads with nowhere to sit and nothing moving. Officials repeatedly discourage roof riding before and during the gathering. Announcements, warnings, safety campaigns at the station, none of it fully stops the practice, because for many pilgrims, a dangerous ride home is still faster, cheaper, and more certain than any other option available that day. This is not a story about recklessness for its own sake. It is a story about a rail system, built and staffed for a certain volume of daily traffic, absorbing a religious gathering that multiplies that volume by a scale the infrastructure was never designed to carry, for 3 concentrated days, once a year, at a single junction north of the capital. Falls and accidents involving overcrowded trains are reported around this event in most years. Exact figures are difficult to verify and vary from source to source and year to year. What stays consistent is the pattern. The trains keep running, the crowds keep arriving, and the roofs keep filling. Because for millions of people, reaching this gathering and getting home again afterward matters enough to accept the risk that comes with the only transportation actually available on those 3 days. Unlike every other railway on this list, nothing about the Tongi line itself is dangerous by design. There is no cliff, no ocean, no volcanic caldera underneath it. The danger here is entirely human, created not by rock or water or unstable ground, but by how many people decide on the same handful of days every year that the destination is worth whatever the ride demands of them. And that, more than any single bridge or mountain pass, is the pattern connecting every railway on this list. 7 railways, 7 completely different landscapes, decades, and continents apart. A sea bridge that outlasted a cyclone and was finally retired by rust instead of the ocean. A colonial steel crossing still carrying commuters over a jungle valley more than a century after it was built for a different empire's cargo. A gold rush line blasted into cliffs by rope and dynamite that outlived the rush itself. A volcanic caldera railway torn apart by an earthquake and rebuilt anyway on ground that could move again at any time.
A mountain descent that has opened and closed more times than most of its passengers will ever know. A railway built on forced labor and tens of thousands of deaths, kept running today so the cost is never forgotten. And a modern rail line pushed 3 days a year, far past anything its engineers ever designed it to carry. None of these railways survived because they were safe. Some of them were never safe at all. Not during construction, not during operation, and in a few cases, not even now. The danger was never removed. It was accepted.
They survived because each time somebody decided the alternative was worse. Losing the trade route, losing access to the gold, losing a war, losing the fastest way home from the most important gathering of the year. That same calculation still follows every one of these railways, whether it runs daily, seasonally, partially, or on newly rebuilt steel. A railway does not survive because the ground is stable, the bridge is new, or the route is certified safe. It survives as long as someone still believes the journey is worth the risk.